Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Geopolitics over Coffee podcast. Today is March 23rd, 2025. We are your hosts, Ish and Eli. Hey, Eli.
Hi, yes.
Here we will be discussing some major geopolitical events happening around the world these days. We've been studying together for the last 2 years and have spent countless hours analyzing these themes. So now we have decided to bring our discussions to the fore over a cup of coffee. For our first episode, we are talking about the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the heart of Africa. Eli, remind me why we chose to talk about Congo today.
Well, thanks, Ish. And I'm happy to join you in this conversation over coffee regarding geopolitics. So, Congo is very much relevant today because currently, with the war in Gaza, in Ukraine, and the actions and policies of the new administration in the US taking all the oxygen in the world discussions, we felt that the war in DRC deserves our attention for the humanitarian devastation it is causing and its geopolitical implication in the African continent.
And most recently, just a couple of days ago, Doha has happened.
Yeah, it's Doha is very interesting because the two leaders who are involved in the conflict, Tshisekedi and the Rwandan president
Paul
uh,
Kagame.
Paul Kagame, yes, they met in Doha and agreed and released a joint statement.
But before we go on to what's happening right now,
Yeah,
let's first get into a background of what this conflict is all about.
yeah. The current conflict involves the M23. It's a Tutsi dominated armored group in eastern Congo, and the current conflict started in 2021 and it continued up to 2024, where M23 advanced into eastern Congo, taking over the biggest city in eastern Congo, Goma, and
Which
it's
had fallen
advanced.
earlier as well, right? Goma's always
Yeah,
found itself in the crosshairs of M23 and the rebels earlier as well.
yeah, that's actually interesting because M23 was established in 2012 and mentioning better rights and political representation for the Tutsi in the Congo. And there was a conflict in 2012 which involved several actors, and M23 was pushed back and was removed from Goma with the help of the UN and other armored elements in the Congo and the Congolese National Army. And it's interesting, the current round of conflict is, a result of or allegedly by M23, the failed integration of Tutsi armored elements with the Congolese army and requesting better representation in Congo politics.
Now, obviously, the armed conflict in Congo is a very complicated issue and it has multiple layers. You mentioned the ethnic dimension to it very briefly just now, and there are other significant enough contributing factors like the biggest villain of all, colonization, a weak polity in the region. There's obviously the resource dimension to it with the copper, coltan, and cobalt mines in Eastern Congo. But today we are discussing a very specific dimension. We are talking about the internationalization of this internal armed conflict in Congo and the role of transnational alliances in the Congo War.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. And this doesn't get much coverage in the media, and it's high time that we talk about it. And added to the layers that you mentioned, colonialism, ethnic elements, weak governance structures, and geography. The Congo is the second largest rainforest in the world, and that has its own implication as well. But the geopolitical dynamics and the neighboring countries of DRC are involved in the conflict, and understanding that context is very much important. So DRC is surrounded by 9 countries. You have Rwanda, you have Burundi, you have Uganda, you have the Republic of the Congo, and you have Angola, you have South Sudan, and all these countries at one point have involved in the conflict.
In
And
the
in the
previous
current
Congo wars.
in the previous two Congo wars, which took place in 1996 to 97, and the second war from 1998 to 2003. And in all of this conflict dynamics, you see a dominant role being played by DRC's neighbors, and it's actually interesting.
So we'll be talking about that. And let's go over what's happening right now in Congo. Give us a summary of the most recent updates.
Well, the most interesting recent update is the talks in Doha, where the president of DRC and the president of Rwanda met in Doha and released a joint statement saying that there will be a cessation of hostilities agreement will be signed. But it's actually interesting because this cessation of hostilities being implemented is not certain because M23 was not involved in the talks. And while talks in Doha were happening, military actions in Eastern Congo by the M23 was undergoing. And parallel to the Doha talks, there is an African-led peace efforts which has not bear fruit yet. The Luanda process led by Angola and the East African community process based in Nairobi.
Nairobi.
Yeah. So it's interesting because in the Doha talks, it was mentioned that Doha is not another parallel process, but there is an agreement by the leaders to merge the two Luanda and Nairobi processes. So it's interesting to see what would come out of it.
It's also interesting because the M23, which, like you mentioned, wasn't on the table at Doha. It was
Yeah,
supposed to be there in Luanda for talks, which never happened, and Doha happened instead. But the M23 captured a town in northern Kivu province, the Walikale town, and
yeah,
initially refused to honor the ceasefire. But today, I think about 24 hours ago from our recording time, they've agreed to withdraw, and they've started the process of withdrawal. So the
yeah,
M23 for now seems to be complying with the cessation of hostilities agreement. But
yeah.
Qatar is a very interesting venue for multiple reasons. Tell us why.
Well, it is interesting because one, it shows that the regional peacemaking efforts by countries of the East African community and the SADC processes have not been fruitful so far. And it is a good thing that the parties have decided to sit down and have a conversation. But what makes the Qatari process interesting is it's nothing new and it's a continuation of previous foreign policy approach by Qatar, which looks for you know, having that diplomatic prowess and prestige in bringing conflicting parties in the in their capital and trying to facilitate talks. And they have done it before, with the talks with the Taliban in the US, with the conversations and talks between Hamas and some Israeli elements. So I would say it's an interesting development.
And
In
Darfur.
in Darfur as well, yeah. In 2012, they managed to, provide financial support and facilitate the talks between Darfuri armed groups and the Sudanese government, which resulted in the signing of a cessation of hostilities. And that has also its own dimension in the Gulf political dynamics because you have the UAE and Saudi and others, and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
2017 rift between Qatar and UAE and others. But as it stands now, it's a positive development that the parties have decided to. to talk, and Qatar was involved in that
Well,
conversation.
Qatar can always be subject to another podcast for by us because there's obviously
Yeah,
this very interesting dimension of how they have non-state actors along with state actors, whereas the Emiratis and Saudi peacekeeping is usually between state actors a lot more. But nonetheless, the timing is also curious, and you mentioned how the parallel talks failed, but I think we should probably focus more on the role of Rwanda as the
mhm.
primary facilitator of this peace agreement on the other side to Felix Tshisekedi of Congo, because Rwanda seems to be sponsoring the M23, and they are obviously
Allegedly, because they never,
allegedly
yeah,
so they've never really admitted to a direct role explicitly in Congo.
yeah,
But tell us more about the role of Rwanda in the conflict and why they were the ones on the table in Doha.
yeah. It's very interesting because if you remember, you mentioned the internationalization of the conflict in the Congo, and I think it is fair to say that Rwanda is directly involved in that because in the previous Congo wars, Rwanda and Uganda were instrumental. It, like the timing of the first Congo war is very interesting because it broke out in 96, 2 years after the Rwanda genocide, and the conflict is interesting because one, the Eastern Congo is home to a Tutsi population, and there is also another element where the Rwandan president stated that the Hutu Interhamwe militia and armored groups that were responsible for the genocide in Rwanda took shelter in the Congo, in Eastern Congo, and in the refugee camps there were some trainings and alleged support being provided by Kinshasa to these groups. So there was a sense of insecurity which sparked the conflict. And now I do believe that there is a continuation of that factor all the way to 2025 and the involvement of M23 and its Tutsi element within it and Rwanda's connection to that fact. So, so one of the interesting elements in the conflict is what the M23 are demanding is a better representation of the Tutsi in the Congo politics. The demographic elements in the Congo is like a major Bantu and Pygmy uh, groups and sub clans and groups under that. So the Eastern Congo is home to while to other Bantu and other groups in the Congo, but it also is home to Hutus and Tutsis who are majorities and minorities in Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda as well. So
So
that element is key.
on that note, since you mentioned Burundi and Uganda as well, let's talk
Yeah,
about Rwanda is obviously a tenth the size of Congo in geographical area right now. And
yeah.
it doesn't seem like they've been acting on it alone. There seems to be a lot of alliances uh, and transnational alliances. That's where they come in. So also explain what transnational alliances mean. But who all are allied with the Rwandans on this issue, or rather, who all are allied with the M23 right now?
So in talking about transnational alliances, it's important to understand what it is at first. And in international relations, the major actors are considered to be states, but then in as it occurs and in post Cold War period, there was a huge development that involves civil wars and conflict, and you have elements who desire to separate from a state or who want to engage in self-determination, and the ethnic elements in these countries resulted in a vast majority of conflicts erupting in domestic politics. So you have non-state armed groups who operate in these countries. And now the traditional and orthodox definition of alliances does not take into account the existence of non-state actors.
Right, yeah.
Scholars came up with this concept of transnational alliances. In terms of alliances, also include not only just between states, but also non-state armed
Non-state
groups.
actors, yeah. And
So
so it's the M23, it's the Rwandans. There seems to be a coalition of other small organizations also along with the M23. The name is slipping my head, but their umbrella coalition is also it has a
yeah,
specific name.
yeah,
And what about the neighbors, Uganda
yeah.
and Burundi? Are they also currently involved, or have they been more on the sidelines in this round of the conflict?
I think everybody's involved to some degree because so many interests come into like the fore, and like you cannot divorce the domestic from the regional in this
Mm,
context because
yeah.
you share people, you share the borders are porous, and your interests are very much interrelated with what's happening in your neighboring country. So it is why you see the fluidity of alliances and the shifting of alliances throughout the continuum.
And
And
these alliances are shifting here as well, right? So, what are some of the driving factors?
so the driving factors are three in broad uh, specifications. You can say so. It follows the very nature of the state in Africa and how the political systems operate. In this regard, you would have three major elements playing into that. You have political survival, and you have resources, and then you have, you know, kinship and ethnic affinities across borders.
Let's dig deeper there then. Of
Okay.
course, economics is the resource constraint, the resource paradox. Economics is always a really big factor in a lot of these conflicts, and that's understandable. But I want to talk about the other two a bit more. Let's first talk about the question of political survival.
Yeah.
And a specific, I think, dimension that I wanted to explore is we are talking about political survival of a leader, not political survival of a state necessarily. So, how much of these transnational alliance involvements and the causes behind shifting nature of alliances is the personality of the leader vis-a-vis the interests of the whole state, especially in the case of Rwanda, but probably also in the likes of Burundi and Angola, which have not acted in the same way as they have in the past. They've changed their actions and interests a bit.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because the transnational alliance theory is it's more focused on the strategic aspect and analysis at the leadership level, and it focuses and more gives more emphasis on the decisions and the policies of leaders and what takes them. So every politician who is holding on to power would want to consolidate it, maintain it, and remain in power as much as possible. So it stems from that concept. But again, given the political systems in Africa, although most African countries hold elections, these elections and they are, I mean, this electoral democracy uh, somewhat is not open and free and fair as such. So leaders engage in, maintaining the power they have as long as they want. That's why
So
you
then it's
see,
all about power. That's all
yeah,
it
that's what
is.
I
It's a
say.
power game.
Exactly. So what the leader calculates as advantages to remain in power as much as possible is what's driving that. So you can tie the resource element into that and the ethnic element into that as well.
That's a good
So
segue, actually, on the ethnic dimension of this, because um, it seems that the conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis, particularly in Congo, is very, very diverse. But between these two specifically, has very strong international connections. You alluded to
yeah,
that when you spoke of how these minorities are present across Uganda and Burundi as well. So
yeah,
let's talk about this ethnic dimension in a bit more detail.
yeah. The ethnic element is again tied to the political survival of the leader because one, in most situations, then there are studies to support this. Since decolonization, the 60s, most leaders have been ousted from power through rebellions and coups. So that makes it even more important that you remain and consolidate your power through you strengthening your political base and as well as having a strong army to maintain you in power.
And
And one,
this is also probably because of a legacy, continued legacy from the scramble of Africa, which sort of split ethnic communities across different state boundaries, preventing that effective consolidation of communities, right?
exactly, and African states are not formed organically. They are essentially a product of colonial projects. So that ties into that because since communities are divided in two, you have cross-border relations that could be securitized and militarized in a way which becomes a threat to one's political seat. And the conflict in DRC is can be a good example in this regard because as we mentioned earlier, we said the first Congo war erupted after 2 years of the Rwandan genocide.
Yeah,
And because those who have been accused of the genocide in Rwanda
are
fled,
in Congo.
yes, fled to Congo. They were in huge numbers. So the
Yeah.
refugee camps were used as training camps. And there was the threat of this organized, previously engaged in genocide parties were seen and perceived as a threat to uh, Kigali. So, as a retaliation measure, the Rwandese were engaged in supporting other Tutsi groups in Eastern Congo who settled there, and they started providing military support, and which actually resulted after the first Congo War, the the Rwandese allied with an armed group led by Kabila,
Laurent
and
Kabila.
yeah, after the war, they put him in Kinshasa. But then it didn't take long for Kabila to divorce himself from Rwanda and ally himself with Angola.
Which
And as a
also sort of plays into our earlier discussion on shifting alliances. Uh,
exactly.
But we are nearing the end of our time here, and this has been a great discussion. But before we close, I think there were still a couple of things that I wanted to ask you about, specifically,
Mhm.
potentially when we look at this region, and it's a fitting case for why any conflict in Congo would be the Great African War. So potentially there are a lot of influencers on the stage.
Yeah.
Of course, I had noticed that the South Africans were really active recently.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Luanda and Nairobi processes under the EAC and the SADC. The Arabs, not just the Qataris, the Arabs could be potential brokers as well. Not to mention the great powers, the usual suspects, right? The colonizers, the Europeans, and then you have the Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians as well. So, have any of these other players been more active? And do they carry any influence in terms of what might happen in Congo next?
Well, I hope they do because the devastation in the current round of conflict that resulted for, the displacement of millions and the death and destruction of the Congo needs to be stopped. And other well-meaning countries and actors should encourage the parties to come to the negotiating table and so that there would be a, a peaceful resolution to the conflict. But I think the fact that it's very complicated and like the countries in the region who seems to have a vested interest and a historical legacy of having direct involvement in the conflict dynamics, it would be tricky to see what that would lead to, because you have the UN, which is engaged in supporting the government in Kinshasa,
Mm.
in involved in military confrontation with M23 and other armed groups,
Is it
and
via the
you have
peacekeeping force?
yes, and it has a mandate to provide prevention and engage in conflict when it comes to defending populations there. And you have the East African community, which has Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, and others, when essentially DRC as well involved in the talks. So you have countries and leaders who, with a vested interest, involved in that process. So there is a conflict of interest there. And then in the SADC, you have DRC involved, you have Zimbabwe, you have Angola, you have South
Mm.
Africa there, who which recently withdrew from DRC because there was a battalion that was from SADC that was involved, which withdrew and announced its withdrawal from the RSC, and which resulted in complications between South Africa and Rwanda as well. So
Interesting.
it's a very complicated thing, but I think the conflicting parties for the for the time being see a military solution to the thing, because the government in Kinshasa wants to annihilate and destroy M23, and the M23, with the support of alleged support from Rwanda and others, it's looking to expand and advance as much as possible so that it would increase its bargaining power. So in the near future, it would be good to see a cessation of hostilities signed for humanitarian reasons, but unless the root causes of the conflict are addressed, I don't see the conflict being resolved anytime soon.
Definitely. Looking further to the next few, let's say, weeks, what are some
Mhm.
of the major sort of events that we can anticipate to track and see if any further progress is made in any direction?
Well, as we said earlier, I think the talks in Doha are a positive development where the two leaders understand and sat together. Although that also has its own political implications on why the two leaders decided to do that. But it's a good sign that there could be a possibility for the two parties to talk, and it paves the way for productive talks in the future. And I think, since in their joint statement stated that they are open to continue future discussions and to merge the Luanda and Nairobi process so that the parties would not resort to forum shopping, that would bring the parties together and have a single and solidified process that would facilitate cessation of hostilities. And I think the M23 would would engage and in the talks, and possibly there might be a sustained cessation of hostilities for the sake of the people.
Well, we always hope, for the sake of the people, that it's the most peaceful outcome possible, given the circumstances. But on that note, I think we have come to an end of our podcast discussion. I realized this only after doing the whole recording that today is March 23rd, and
Yeah.
M23 stands for March 23rd. It didn't strike me at all while we were recording this. But
Yeah.
this is great, and we'll continue this discussion on another topic next week. So, thank you so much to all our listeners for tuning in with us, and we'll see you with another episode of Geopolitics over coffee next time.
Yeah. Thank you, Ish. This has been great.